how should life be lived? A question which all ruminate about, with eyes wide open amid long and restless nights. We all want the good life, the life wherein all our wishes, hopes, and dreams come to fruition, a lifelong stupefaction which manifests from ad infinitum fulfillment. A heaven on earth, a prayer said in the back of all our minds. An impossibility for the most part. There will always be something to discourage us, something to dishearten us. But that momentary discouragement need not last more than that, a moment. We can achieve some semblance of heaven on earth, and the only means available to apprehend our desired heaven on earth be the lifestyles we adopt. The lifestyles we have all chosen, either consciously or unconsciously, at some point or another. Those ways of living which we all swear are the best and most preferable ways to live. There is a myriad of lifestyles to pick from, and so we cannot explore each. Thus, herein shall be a reflection on asceticism and how it can be of great benefit in our goal of heaven on earth. We shall use asceticism to answer the question of how life should be lived. What is asceticism? The definition of asceticism is the practice of strict self-denial as a measure of personal and especially spiritual discipline, the condition, practice, or mode of life of an ascetic. What this looks like in more detail and less abstraction is as follows. An ascetic lifestyle involves strict adherence to higher order goals or doctrines rather than leisure or mindless entertainment. For instance, a priest who commits himself to a spiritual doctrine does so wholeheartedly. Of the behaviors, beliefs, and routines demanded from him by the doctrine, a full and willing commitment is made. The fewer deviations from the practices which the spiritual doctrine prescribes to the priest, the more ascetic the priest can be said to be. But asceticism of that sort is found elsewhere as well. Priests and spiritual adherents aren't the only ascetics. People who have lofty goals and are generally considered high achievers also tend to be more ascetic. The pursuit of immediate pleasures seldom leads to the realization of long-term goals. So, one must forego immediate pleasure for higher pleasure. Therefore, high achievers become something like temporary ascetics. Now we may suppose of asceticism that it is a lifestyle only for those who either reject or avoid, in the name of some spiritual doctrine or long-term goal, the immediate pleasures of life. But that would be wrong. The description of asceticism we have given thus far is, beyond doubt, incomplete. We cannot mimic the behavioral patterns of a priest and then suppose ourselves to be ascetic. No, that is not asceticism. Asceticism is an internal form of being. Though ascetics have a specific lifestyle, the ascetic lifestyle emanates from the subjective experiences of the person, an inwardly guide which shapes the extended and surrounding environment. Put otherwise, asceticism is a qualitatively different mode of experiencing the world, not some restrictive set of external behaviors. Asceticism is, as Richard Valantasis defines it in his book, the making of self, performances within a dominant social environment intended to inaugurate a new subjectivity, different social relations, and an alternative symbolic universe. Richard Valantasis. Apparent in the definition of asceticism put forward by Valantasis, asceticism encourages individuality more than it encourages the deferral of immediate gratification. Though deferral of gratification is an essential component to asceticism, it is not the focus. Because asceticism uses resistance, be it social or personal, it thusly follows that asceticism will always favor individuality. An ascetic is resistant towards group decision, because asceticism requires a willful denial by the agent, and so ascetic doctrines have to emphasize the power of the individual rather than on the group. But Valantius believes asceticism encourages individuality in another way. Asceticism, however, always defines itself as resistant or withdrawn from a perceived or a real dominant context. My theory, then, relates to the way resistant people or groups relate to larger social, religious, and political communities. Another way of looking at this is to say that enculturation looks to erase difference, while asceticism intends to create difference. Richard Valantius, his conception involves a relativity of sorts. Rather than placing emphasis on the individual's will, Valantius emphasizes the categorically distinct subjectivities amongst groups, and that therefore makes his view relative. Consider, if we had two groups inside society, one dominant and the other not, but both placed a strong emphasis on the power of the individual will, and both are aptly characterized by pursuit of higher order and spiritual goals, then both would be ascetic. But from Valantius's view, the smaller and more deviant group would be considered the ascetic one. The reason for such an outcome is the appeal to context. If being ascetic means to be resistant or withdrawn from a dominant context, then we can never have a context with two ascetic groups, wherein one group is more dominant than the other, only because resistance towards the dominant socio-political context is, definitionally so, a feature of asceticism. So, I agree with Valantius about asceticism involving a different mode of subjectivity, but I am in disagreement about the contextual semantics he incorporates into his definition. It seems, as demonstrated above, that the contextual aspects leave room for absurd conclusions, namely, supposing of two groups of ascetics that one is not ascetic while the other is, simply by their virtue of being non-dominant. I wholeheartedly believe asceticism at its core is about the will of the individual. Difference between asceticism and hedonism. Hedonism and asceticism don't necessarily negate one another. In order to understand this, let us recount some of the core features of hedonism and asceticism. Hedonism, pain or pleasure of outcome, determines action. Pain or pleasure motivate action, depending on our equilibrium. What is pleasurable has value, and what is painful lacks value. Asceticism, emphasis on individuality, emphasis on will, deferral of gratification. Superficially speaking, some of these seem to contradict one another. An ascetic individual cannot pursue pleasure while at the same time defer gratification, and an hedonistic person cannot place an emphasis on will if he or she constantly engages in impulsive pleasure. So, there seems to be a difference between asceticism and hedonism which cannot be reconciled. But that would be wrong to think, I believe. However, let us first consider opinions within the literature. Some philosophers have put forth the claim that sages live a good life, and therefore ascetic sages are hedonistic. Their lives are pleasurable. Such, however, depends on a distinction between attitudinal pleasure and sensory pleasure. A sensory pleasure is something like a delicious sweet or lifting weights. We derive enjoyment from some form of sensation or sensory content. In contrast to sensory pleasure, we have attitudinal pleasure. Attitudinal pleasure is about the intentional attitude we have towards something. We can have intentional states wherein which we are happy about some outcome. For instance, I can derive pleasure from recalling that I proposed to my spouse in a rather romantic fashion. Herein, no sensory content was, seemingly, responsible for the pleasure derived. The pleasure seemed to be caused by some mental attitude towards a memory that I hold. So, ascetic sages are argued to be hedonists because they derive attitudinal pleasure from their daily tasks. Meditation, prayer, and quiet reflection seem to be things which manifest attitudinal pleasure. So, although sages uncontroversially said, abstain from sensory pleasure, their engagement with attitudinal pleasure revokes them from their claim to asceticism, and the same would likewise be said about someone who is ascetic. Namely, ascetics are actually hedonists because they derive attitudinal pleasure from their daily routines. And so it seems asceticism is impossible. But I disagree. Not only do I believe asceticism and hedonism to be compatible with one another, but I likewise deny the implicit assumption that attitudinal pleasure is a constant factor. I think ascetics are mistakenly labeled as ant-hedonistic. Asceticism, as defined by both myself and Valentesis, allows for hedonistic motivators or outcomes. That is because asceticism focuses on the will or individuality rather than the negation of pleasure. It just so happens that a resistance towards pleasure is a good way to demonstrate one's will or individuality. But that fails to entail the logical negation of hedonistic activities. So, asceticism and hedonism are indeed compatible. Moreover, if we take the false assumption that ascetics are entirely anti-pleasure, then the argument from attitudinal hedonism at best states, ascetics enjoy some minimal pleasure. Attitudes are mental states which we endure for some time, and so we can say that if the ascetic has a pleasure-based attitude, then the ascetic's hedonism is temporary. The reason being because asceticism is better characterized by dull or flat mental states, no elation. And so, when they recollect some positive attitude toward something, it will be short, only because an ascetic will soon switch their mental state back to the blankness which it was once before. Thus, even if we grant the attitudinal hedonism argument, it is a weak one at best. We can hereby say hedonism and asceticism are compatible. Any arguments that attempt to negate asceticism by supposing asceticism to be too restrictive or against pleasure are simply mistaken. So, although asceticism and hedonism are different, both can be adhered to at the same time. Reasons to not be ascetic. Asceticism has plenty of benefits if adhered to, but asceticism can become dysfunctional as well. Of the many dysfunctional ways in which asceticism can manifest, extreme reactions to life come most readily to mind: asceticism and bad habits. We all have some bad habits in life. Some of us drink too much, some of us watch too much television, and some of us spend too many hours on video games. Bad habits can be pervasive and deeply pernicious, so much so that our ability to function as humans becomes impacted. An unfortunate circumstance to find ourselves in, having bad habits. But just as unfortunate is when we attempt to fix those bad habits with something as detrimental. When we try to solve our dysfunctional habits by adopting an ascetic outlook on life, we begin to suppress our inclinations towards life rather than focus on our will. An asceticism adopted from a position of want, that is, a want to negate our bad habits, is a dysfunctional asceticism. Such an asceticism focuses on negation of habits and misses the point. Ascetic social withdrawal. Social life can be filled with challenges of all sorts. We have to be cautious about what we say, who we say it to, and when we say it. We have to understand the relationships between various social classes, and we have to be adept at reading the minds of other people. Social life can be quite difficult, and as with any domain of skill, there are disparities in ability and hardships that come from failure. Herein, asceticism can be used as a justification to withdraw from society. On the one hand, when we have no skill in a sport, we will refuse to play it. We much prefer to participate in those things which we are skilled at. And on the other hand, when we fail miserably at doing something, we can become discouraged. These two facts can, unconsciously, push someone into a dysfunctional asceticism. Because asceticism is often misunderstood as a renunciation of all pleasures, it follows that an ascetic will have to disengage from society and live a reserved life. They cannot attend parties, they cannot entertain romantic relationships, nor can they enjoy banter with friends. Asceticism, in this misunderstood form, can be used as a justification to mask insecurities and shortcomings, reasons to be ascetic. Since unhealthy asceticism pertains to extreme reactions to overcome some shortcoming or negative habit, then what is healthy asceticism? What are the reasons to be ascetic? Self-mastery. Healthy asceticism is about proper reason and focus. A healthy ascetic should never become ascetic for malformed reasons, such as the negation of bad habits. At best, doing so will entail nothing more than the pursuit of a goal which is devoid of pleasure rather than becoming an ascetic. Someone should become an ascetic because they have a preference for the lifestyle associated with such a philosophy. Likewise, a healthy ascetic should have as their primary focus the bringing under control their will. To make decisions in accordance with the will of the person is to be an ascetic, and that is what ought to be the primary focus when becoming an ascetic, not the negation of bad habits or ignoring of shortcomings. Therefore, the reason one ought to become is to pursue self-mastery, to strive for complete control over our will. A life lived in control of one's self entails, by necessity, a good life, unless one supposes themselves to be incapable of making good decisions for one's own life. But I am of the belief that if I were to make all my decision from a position of will, to the extent that such is possible, I will have lived a good life. Since asceticism pushes us to focus on manifesting a stronger will, a stronger sense of self-mastery, then we will be less susceptible to distractions, less susceptible to action done by pure whim, less susceptible to the regret one feels when they are unable to pursue their goals or dreams. Asceticism can save our lives if only we adopt its practices